Hello and welcome back to the 10,000 Startups Podcast. This is Roger Royce, your host of the podcast. I'm a partner with Haynes, Boone in Palo Alto, and every week we bring you original new content on legal issues of relevance to startup companies. And this week is going to be a little bit more targeted, a little bit more specific to companies that are in the biotech, medical tech, health science, life sciences space. We're going to be talking about some new rules. Well, I guess they're not so new now, but let's say recent rules that the FDA has proposed that would classify laboratory tests as medical devices so that they could be regulated. Very controversial set of rules. The legal issues around this are a lawyer's playground. And honestly, it's been a little hard finding people that want to talk about it. But I just had to look in my own backyard and find two lawyers from Haynes, Boone in Dallas that know quite a lot about this. So we have today to speak on this two lawyers, Luke Nguyen, he's an associate in Dallas, and also Kayla Cristales. And first of all, welcome. You know, this is such a big topic. I needed two lawyers to explain it, I guess. But thanks for being here. And just to kind of set the stage, feel free to introduce yourselves, but and tell us in a little bit more detail than I've given you what this rule is and why it's different from what we had before.
Sure. I am Kayla Cristales, and this is Luke Nguyen, and we are in the FDA regulatory and compliance practice in our Dallas office. And this rule basically undid the longstanding policy under which FDA exercised enforcement discretion for all laboratory developed tests. So to understand kind of the new rule, you have to understand a little bit of background and a couple key terms. So LDTs, or laboratory developed tests, it's a specific type of in vitro diagnostic test that meet the following definition. So they have to be intended for clinical use and designed, manufactured, and used within the same laboratory. And so if you historically tests that met that definition were not required to comply with device regulations. And FDA had a very well understood policy of enforcement discretion. And so labs making LDTs didn't have to worry about pre-market clearance, pre-market approval, the quality system regulation, all of those really burdensome device regulations that traditional in vitro diagnostic tests do have to comply with.
Hey,
so,
Kayla, can I stop you for a second here?
Sure.
You know, I'm just a lawyer, so I'm going to stop you in some of these technical terms. When you say in vitro, what do you mean by in vitro, and you know, how does that differ from maybe in vivo or something like that?
Sure. So like blood and saliva tests, your typical like the tests that you probably have had run on you when you go to the doctor. I had twins not long ago, so I'm very familiar with blood tests because they do a million of those on you when you're pregnant with twins, apparently. But yes, don't any kind of. Did you have an example of an IVD that you want to?
Yeah, I think a big focus on FDA's regulations of IVDs would be something as simple as the COVID-19 at-home test. That's a good example. So since those are not within a single laboratory and they're marketed to the consumer, they're regulated as IVDs.
Yeah, and not as LDTs.
Okay.
Yes, so any tests that don't meet the definition of an LDT have always been regulated as traditional IVDs, in vitro diagnostics, which are devices under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So like I said, prior to the new rule, there was a policy of enforcement discretion. If you meet the definition of an LDT, FDA is not going to enforce device regulations against you. So the new rule, and you'll see quickly why it's so controversial, the FDA basically decided no more enforcement discretion for LDTs. They are going to treat them as traditional IVDs and devices under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. subject to some exemptions that Luke is going to chat about. But the big takeaway is, before, all you have to do is meet the definition of an LDT, and you don't have to worry about compliance with device regs. After the new rule, that's not enough. You have to meet one of these limited exemptions, or you have to comply with everything, which means, getting pre-market, whether it's 510(k) clearance or a de novo authorization, may require clinical studies, a lot of regulatory hoops to jump through. You have to register as a device manufacturer and keep that up to date. Have to get all of your processes to comply with FDA's very onerous quality system regulation. So it's a lot that these labs, especially the smaller labs, have never been required to really even think about. And now all of a sudden they're going to, through the phase out policy, which Luke will also cover, there, step by step, if the rule is implemented, they're going to be required to comply with all of these things.
Wow. Okay. Let me stop you there. First of all, the impact sounds huge, especially for my startup company. It sounds expensive, what you just described.
Exactly.
Sounds like a lot of cost and a lot of delay. And it seems to me, from my standpoint, it feels like this is going to keep companies out of the market. That's just my kind of gut reaction, is that it's going to be fewer companies are going to be able to get into the market, is my sense. Can you tell me what's the reason for this rule? Have things not been working out well under the current rules?
So the rationale is, it ties to kind of the evolution of laboratory technology and the marketplace in general over time. So when FDA first started exercising enforcement discretion, around the time that the regulations that apply to medical devices went into effect, which was in the 1970s, the labs that were making laboratory developed tests were smaller labs, small patient population, everything's in-house, very low risk. And now technology has made it so that huge national labs can meet this definition, but still, they may be receiving specimens from across the country, and they're serving far bigger patient populations. So from FDA's perspective, the scope of what they originally intended with their enforcement discretion, the population and the labs to which it applied really grew, and they felt like it's not safe for them to continue unregulated. So that's FDA's position.
Let me stop you as well, because I did do a little bit of homework here, and I did read this FDA study that came out. And one of the things that came through, well, not all of it, but parts of it. And one of the things that came through to me is a belief that there are a lot of these tests that are either unsafe or ineffective. And that's what they were trying to crack down on.
Right.
And, which is always going to be the case when you innovate. It's, the first few times might not work. But that seems to have really gotten the attention and the ire of the FDA. Is kind of my, non-regulatory lawyer view of this. I was going to ask you, is this effective right now, or does this go into effect later?
Yeah, so the rule is currently effective. It became effective in July of 2024. But the first compliance date that occurs for the phase-out policy won't take place until May 6, 2025. And then each stage of the new rule has a compliance date that is usually a year following the previous stage. So the first stage will be things like reporting requirements and adverse events. And that's the May 6, 2025 compliance deadline. Second stage focuses more on registration and device listing, labeling, regulations, and that's the following year, May 6, 2026. And then the third phase is the quality system requirements that Kayla talked about earlier, and that's in May 6, 2027. And then stage 4 probably won't apply to a ton of LDTs just because it's for high risk LDTs. And in the final rule, FDA said that they didn't expect a ton of LDTs to qualify as high risk. But that's when companies will be expected to comply with the PMA requirements. And that'll be November 6th, 2027.
What's
and
PMA?
then,
PMA
uh,
requirements?
the,
Pre-market approval. So
Oh,
that's
okay.
the class 3 devices before they can get on the market, and high risk class 2 devices have to submit and be granted pre-market approval or a PMA.
Gotcha.
So it's one of the pathways to market for devices. The others are 510K clearance, which is for most class 2 devices. And then a de novo authorization is kind of its own little category for devices that would be subject to 510K clearance, but they're novel. And so they kind of have to establish, forge their own path through a de novo.
Okay.
But it's super rare for an IVD, for an in vitro diagnostic test, to require a PMA, just because the nature of diagnostic tests, they're not really within the category of high risk medical devices that typically require a PMA. That's things, implanted in the body, and, the stuff that where the safety risks are inherently high.
And now under this new rule, they do require a PMA. Is that what you're saying? Or not always?
So he was saying for is this phase 4?
Yeah, so stage 4 would be the stage that would require a PMA, but those are only for the high risk LDTs, which will be pretty rare. Stage 5
for
is,
most LDTs,
yeah.
Stage 4 won't apply.
Yeah, but stage 5 is when the moderate and low risk LDTs that require a 510K or the de novo pathway that Kayla just mentioned, that's when they'll be expected to comply with the pre-market requirements.
Okay.
And that's in May of 2028, which seems like a long time from now, but for labs and companies that will have to comply with that stage, I mean, 3 years is actually not that long when you think about having to, first of all, comply with all the other things that came before it, but also prepare to submit a 510K clearance or a de novo application, because you'll need to, it's a lot of steps and a lot of moving parts. And so I think that people are probably crossing their fingers that this rule will, that they would have backpedaled out of it by the time we get to 2028, because that's where a lot of the money is going to come in.
Gotcha. So let me shift gears a little bit and ask, what is industry's reaction been to this? Given that
they love it.
Okay.
Yes, no, it's bad. Industry is really up in arms for a few reasons. Some of the reasons that you mentioned, the arguments against are that there's a reduced potential for innovation, possible reduced access to LDTs for vulnerable populations, substantial money, time, resources, burdens, and also just the practical consideration of, does FDA have the capacity to handle a large influx of these submissions? That process doesn't make a ton of sense. And then in terms of the legal challenge against it, many people, I would say most industry players, don't think that the FDA has the ability to regulate LDTs as devices at all. So they don't think that enforcement discretion is even needed, because they don't have the authority to enforce the medical device regulations against laboratory developed tests. And the rationale behind that is that, the definition of a device is the part that you need to know is that it's, an instrument, apparatus, article, it's a thing. And laboratory developed tests are thought of as services, lab testing services. And so that kind of segues into the lawsuits.
Well, tell me about that. I got to believe there's got to be, spend since July. There must be all sorts of litigation over this, right?
Yeah, so there was a suit filed pretty much immediately after the rule came out by the American Clinical Laboratory Association. And then another lawsuit that followed by the Association for Molecular Pathology. those cases were recently consolidated in the Eastern District of Texas. And essentially, their argument is, as Kayla previewed, that FDA doesn't even have authority to regulate these products because LDTs are not medical devices and they never have been medical devices. And this has been a disagreement between industry and FDA for almost 30 years now. It's kind of just coming to the forefront because of the new rule. So essentially, the American Clinical Laboratory Association is in part trying to use the new Loper-Bright ruling to argue that deference doesn't apply anymore, and the best reading of the statute is that the product does not fall with products do not fall within the definition of a medical device, whereas FDA says it's an unambiguous statute, and it absolutely does fall within. So it should be an interesting development in regulatory law in general as well.
We don't have a decision yet in that case, though, right?
No, not yet.
And where was that filed? What
The
jurisdiction?
Eastern District of Texas.
Of course.
Yep.
They
All the good stuff is down here.
And kind of like what we just saw with the CTA ruling, Corporate Transparency Act ruling, this is a decision that will, I guess, purport to bind the federal government all over the United States. So it'll be an important one to watch. Any ideas? I guess who knows when we'll get a decision, right? Courts act on their own timetable, right?
Yeah, the
Right.
most recent update is that plaintiffs in the case filed a motion for summary judgment. FDA responded with a cross motion for summary judgment, and oral arguments are scheduled for later this month. I want to say February 19th or so. So maybe that'll give us a little more guidance on when a ruling will come. But yeah, we're kind of in a waiting period.
Now you mentioned something. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kayla.
Oh, I was just gonna say it may end up being moot due to the administration change that's
I'm
happening.
gonna
Is that
get
where
to
you're
that.
headed?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, before we do, you mentioned something. I just want to make sure our regular listeners to this podcast will know what you meant when you said the Loper-Bright decision. But just as a reminder, since that case was filed, the U.S. Supreme Court decided a different case that has just very broad, wide-ranging implications. And it changes what we've all known as the Chevron doctrine for many years, where courts would defer in ambiguous cases to the determinations of administrative agencies. But Loper-Bright says, well, no, the court should not defer on questions of law. And if a statute's ambiguous, that almost by definition is a question of law. So we've got a different level of judicial review now. And I think that certainly hurts the FDA and helps I guess the plaintiffs. I think whoever is that's arguing against the regulation in that case. But like you say, this might all be moot because by the time I get this podcast on the air, it could be moot given how fast our current new presidential administration is moving on doing things. So first of all, has anything happened in a new administration on this as of February 12th at 11:30 a.m. Pacific? And secondly, any clues as to what might happen or guesses, or what do we think?
So no formal action. They haven't gotten to this yet. But based on the promises that have been made and the general, our understanding of this administration's views on, big pharma and innovation and the life sciences marketplace in general, at a minimum, I would not expect the FDA under this administration to actively enforce this rule. There's been no direct talk to indicate whether they'll walk it back. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they did. Some of the Congress people, what was it, the Appropriations Act?
Yeah.
From So this was filed in late 2024?
Yeah, so there was a committee report, and in the most recent appropriations bill, there was a note that mentioned that Congress expected FDA not to enforce this rule and to instead work with Congress to regulate LDTs, indicating that there might be something down the line where Congress steps in and takes the authority away from FDA to regulate LDTs.
And the comments, the congressional comments that were included, just referenced the need to modernize FDA regulation to keep up with innovation and the landscape, and that this is an outdated approach. And I think that the exact language said something along the lines of they, direct FDA to immediately suspend plans to enforce this rule, something like that. So that bill has not been enacted as of today, but it does give a little bit of insight into where at least some members of Congress are thinking on
Wow,
this. So,
that is, yeah, I didn't know that. That's really significant. That's huge. And, from time to time, we have seen Congress step in when they don't like what the regulator is doing. Um, and I think I've talked on this podcast before about cases where they've done that with regard to the FDA. So that's pretty significant. And then, I think the listeners ought to know that the nominees, for example, Dr. McKay, a cancer surgeon for FDA nominee, I've read his stuff. He has a libertarian bent to him. So I would expect him to take a different view of this. That's just my kind of speculative prediction here. You've got Congress lined up against this. You've got industry lined up against this. And who knows, we may have, the White House against this as well. So, with all of that uncertainty, what are you telling your clients when they ask you about this?
it's a good question. So we're trying to take a practical approach where we're not ignoring the existence of this rule and what it requires. We're recommending basically a cost benefit analysis of, think through, first of all, confirm that your tests actually meet the definition of LDT, so that this analysis is not applicable at all if it doesn't. So do you have an in vitro diagnostic test that's designed, manufactured, and used within a single laboratory? If not, call us, because you need to get in compliance, because this rule and the prior enforcement discretion policy doesn't technically apply to you. So step one, do you meet the definition of an LDT? Step two, if you do, look at the exemptions under the rule. Do any of them apply to your product? If so, that's very helpful for purposes of reducing costs and burdens, because you should document, the analysis that led you to believing that an exemption applies, and, dot your I's and cross your T's, but other than that, you should be okay. Then, assuming that one of these exemptions does not apply, we're recommending that you assess what would be required to comply. So considering the expenses and burdens and time and resources, is it feasible? And if so, what type of cost and what type of burden are you looking at? And then consider the flip side. What are the potential risks of non-compliance if the rule is ultimately enforced? And so that's not just, a warning letter, something like that. It kind of covers a broader range. So you need to consider areas of indirect risk, reps and warranties and contracts where you're saying you comply with all of these laws. If you're found not to comply, are your contracts in jeopardy? And we also recommend maintaining detailed documentation of any action steps, analyses, any decision making, and then, of course, just actively monitoring all of the moving parts of this rule that may impact its enforceability, and kind of adjusting plans as needed along the way.
Okay. All right. Any other closing thoughts for our audience? Is that pretty
No,
much?
that's it.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for being here. This is Roger Royce with the 10,000 Startups Podcast, and we have been talking about the new FDA rule regulating laboratory developed tests. I want to thank you, Kayla and Luke, for being here. Thank you, audience, and we will see you all next week.